In the years following the end of the Second World War, Texas City was seen as a symbol of American prosperity and progress. Located along the Gulf Coast on Galveston Bay, it had quickly become an industrial powerhouse fueled by its growing network of chemical plants, oil refineries, and a busy deepwater port. The constant hum of machinery, the sight of smoke rising steadily from refinery stacks, and the clanging of steel against steel were all considered signs of economic promise. Families had moved there from across the country, drawn by good wages and steady work in a region that seemed destined to shape the nation's future. The port was central to this success, exporting materials that supported rebuilding efforts in Europe and supplying fuel to power post-war expansion across the United States. Every ship that docked in Texas City represented jobs, opportunity, and civic pride. Tied to the pier in mid-April was a French vessel named the SS Grand Camp. It had arrived to load a chemical that at the time was considered harmless and beneficial. This chemical was ammonium nitrate fertilizer, produced to help revive crops in war-torn countries overseas. Thousands of tons of it were being packed tightly into the ship's cargo holds, sealed in paper sacks stacked high in the dim and confined interior. The product had been widely used for agriculture and was transported regularly through the ports across the world. In Texas City, it was viewed simply as another export, ordinary, unthreatening, and profitable. There was no alarm and no sense of danger. Yet while the town moved through its normal morning routine, changes were already happening deep inside the cargo hold of the Grand Camp. Temperatures were rising, the chemical was beginning to react, and a chain of events had quietly begun, one that would soon transform an ordinary working port into the site of a national tragedy unlike anything the country had ever witnessed. By early morning, faint wisps of smoke began to rise from the cargo hold of the SS Grand Camp. Crew members attempted to control the smoldering chemical by closing the hatches and injecting steam into the hold, hoping to smother the heat. This was a common practice at the time for preventing fires, but ammonium nitrate did not behave like ordinary cargo. Instead of cooling the smoldering material, the steam accelerated the chemical reaction, causing internal pressure to rise. On the dock, longshoremen and port workers noticed the ship's metal sides beginning to bulge slightly, an unusual sign that something was building inside the sealed compartments. Despite the smoke, there was no immediate evacuation. Children were on their way to school. Office workers had just sat down at their desks. Many residents, curious about the smoke, walked toward the waterfront to get a better view. Some recalled hearing popping sounds coming from the ship's interior, a warning sign that went unrecognized. Moments later, at approximately 9 a.m, the chemical reached a critical temperature. The Grand Camp erupted in a catastrophic explosion, sending a massive fireball into the sky and shaking the ground with the force of a small wartime bomb. Witnesses miles away reported seeing windows shatter and debris falling from the sky. The blast instantly destroyed the ship, blasted a crater into the port, and hurled the anchor made of solid steel over a mile inland. Burning metal fragments rained across the industrial district, igniting oil storage tanks and chemical facilities near the shoreline. The wave of hot air scorched everything in its path, while a shock wave flattened buildings, warehouses, and railroad cars. Firefighters who had rushed to the scene were caught in the explosion, and nearly all of the city's firefighting equipment was destroyed in an instant. The blast was so powerful that residents in neighboring communities, including Galveston and Houston, felt the force and believed an earthquake or an enemy attack had occurred. At that moment, Texas City was transformed from a prosperous port community into a disaster zone. Fires broke out across the city, emergency communication lines were disabled, and thick smoke began to blanket the area as a second threat quietly developed nearby, another ship carrying the same volatile cargo. In the immediate aftermath of the Grand Camp explosion, Texas City was thrown into complete disarray. Communication systems were crippled, telephone lines were severed, and emergency coordination became nearly impossible. Fires raged across industrial plants along the waterfront, feeding on crude oil, chemicals, and debris ignited by flaming shrapnel. Thick black smoke rose into the sky, darkening the morning sun and making visibility difficult for rescue workers. Many of the city's firefighters had perished in the blast, leaving Texas City without its primary line of defense just as new fires began to take hold. The situation grew even more alarming when emergency responders realized that a second vessel, the SS High Flyer, was also carrying a large quantity of ammonium nitrate and was now on fire. Throughout the port, confusion turned into panic. Rail yards filled with fuel tankers started to detonate from the intense heat, causing chains of secondary explosions. Industrial facilities containing benzene and other dangerous chemicals began to erupt one after another, creating shockwaves that traveled through the air like rolling thunder. The force of the explosions shattered glass miles away and knocked people off their feet, even in surrounding towns. Roads leading into the city became clogged with vehicles as people tried to flee, while others rushed in searching for loved ones. The hospitals quickly became overwhelmed, and makeshift triage stations were set up in schools, churches, and parking lots. Medical personnel from nearby cities were called in, but even with reinforcements, there were not enough supplies or space to treat everyone in need. Meanwhile, the SS High Flyer continued to burn. Emergency crews attempted to cut it loose from the docks and tow it away to prevent another catastrophic blast. Hours passed as workers struggled against spreading fires, damaged equipment, and dangerous fumes. Despite their efforts, the fire on the second ship reached its critical point. Late into the night, the High Flyer exploded with nearly the same force as the Grand Camp, compounding the devastation. This second blast shattered any remaining infrastructure, ignited fresh fires across the city, and destroyed additional sections of the port. The two explosions together created one of the most destructive industrial disasters in American history, leaving much of Texas City unrecognizable as the sun set on a day of unimaginable destruction. By the morning after the second explosion, Texas City no longer resembled a functioning community. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to twisted metal, splintered wood, and scorched earth. The port district had vanished into a landscape of craters and smoldering debris. Fires still burned across oil refineries and chemical storage tanks, sending columns of smoke into the sky that could be seen for miles. The scale of destruction made navigation difficult, forcing rescue workers to climb over rubble and sift through wreckage by hand. Many roads were blocked by fallen structures, and the air was thick with toxic fumes from chemicals that continued to burn uncontrolled. Within hours, emergency aid began arriving from across the state of Texas and beyond. The American Red Cross established supply stations, providing food, clothing, and medical equipment to survivors. The United States military deployed personnel to assist with recovery efforts, bringing heavy machinery to clear debris and search for missing persons. Temporary morgues were constructed as the death toll rose steadily, with victims identified from personal items because official records had been destroyed. Families searched silently among the ruins, hoping to find any sign of their loved ones. Despite the massive response, there were not enough hospital beds, and many injured citizens had to be transported to cities such as Galveston and Houston for treatment. The disaster also triggered widespread environmental damage. Chemicals spilled into Galveston Bay, killing fish and disrupting the ecosystem. Burning oil flowed into waterways, creating floating slicks that caught fire and spread flames along the shoreline. Air quality was severely compromised, forcing residents to cover their faces with cloth to breathe. Livestock that survived the explosions began to suffer illness from contaminated water sources. In some areas, fires burned for nearly a week before finally being brought under control. Texas City became a scene of continuous emergency operations, with rescue, cleanup, and humanitarian efforts running simultaneously around the clock. As authorities began to assess the situation, it became clear that thousands of people had been left homeless. Entire blocks of houses had been flattened, and what remained was unsafe to inhabit. The loss of infrastructure meant that electricity, water, and sanitation systems were inoperable. The federal government declared the disaster one of the most severe in the nation's history, prompting a large-scale coordinated relief effort. Yet even as the fires were gradually extinguished, the people of Texas City were only beginning to comprehend the full extent of what had happened. The final challenge lay ahead, rebuilding lives, restoring the city, and seeking answers about how such a catastrophe had been allowed to occur. In the months that followed the Texas City disaster, investigators from federal and state agencies examined every detail of the explosions to determine the root cause. The use of ammonium nitrate as cargo was not new, but this catastrophe exposed the dangers of transporting it in bulk without proper safeguards. Reports confirmed that the chemical had been stored in paper sacks within a sealed cargo hold, creating ideal conditions for a rapid buildup of heat and pressure. The disaster prompted widespread scrutiny of industrial safety regulations and forced lawmakers to confront the lack of oversight in maritime shipping and chemical handling. What emerged from these investigations would permanently reshape emergency planning and industry standards across the United States. The human cost was staggering. Thousands were injured, and the official death toll climbed into the hundreds, though the true number was likely higher due to unidentifiable remains. Entire families were lost. The city faced a long and painful rebuilding process that would take years to complete. Donations poured in from across the country, and charitable organizations helped provide temporary housing and basic necessities. Texas City's citizens, many of whom had lost loved ones, homes, or livelihoods, came together in acts of resilience and determination. Despite overwhelming grief, they refused to abandon their community. Legal battles soon followed. Survivors and families of the deceased filed lawsuits against the United States government, arguing that the ammonium nitrate had been manufactured and shipped without adequate warning of its explosive potential. This led to a landmark Supreme Court case that ultimately ruled against the claimants, citing government immunity. Even though financial compensation was limited, the case brought national attention to the responsibilities of both government agencies and private industries in preventing such disasters. This attention spurred changes in federal law that required clearer labeling, improved packaging, and stricter regulation of hazardous materials. Over time, the Texas City disaster came to be known as one of the deadliest industrial accidents in American history. It served as a turning point for workplace safety, disaster response, and chemical regulation. Communities across the nation began implementing evacuation plans, emergency drills, and hazard awareness programs to prevent similar tragedies. Refineries and chemical plants upgraded their safety protocols, and the shipping industry adopted new standards for the storage and transportation of explosive materials. Though the city eventually rebuilt, the memory of that day remained etched into its identity. The legacy of the Texas City disaster was not one of destruction alone. It was also a story of transformation. Out of unimaginable loss came significant progress in public safety, emergency management, and industrial accountability. The disaster served as a permanent reminder of the consequences of complacency and the importance of preparedness. Texas City rebuilt stronger, and its story continues to stand as a powerful lesson of how a single event can change the course of a nation's history. In the 1970s, the city of Bhopal, India, was full of optimism. It was growing, industrializing, and welcoming new opportunities that promised to lift thousands out of poverty. When the American chemical company Union Carbide Corporation opened a pesticide plant on the outskirts of the city, it was seen as a symbol of progress and modern development. The factory, run by its subsidiary Union Carbide India Limited, produced a pesticide called Sevin, widely used across India's vast agricultural lands. But hidden beneath this promise of prosperity was a deadly vulnerability. The key ingredient in Sevin's production was methyl isocyanate, or MIC, a highly toxic, volatile chemical that had to be stored under extremely controlled conditions. Even a small leak could be lethal. Despite this danger, safety standards at the Bhopal plant were significantly weaker than those at Union Carbide's American facilities. Internal reports from the time showed that the company had knowingly approved cost-cutting measures that compromised critical safety systems. By the early 1980s, financial pressures mounted, and corners were cut even further. Skilled workers were laid off and replaced with less trained staff. Routine maintenance was delayed or ignored. Minor gas leaks became common, often dismissed as manageable incidents. Equipment that should have been replaced or repaired was left to deteriorate. What had once been a state-of-the-art facility was now a dangerous maze of corroded pipes and failing machinery. The plant's safety infrastructure, meant to prevent a catastrophic leak, was slowly dismantled by negligence. The refrigeration system, designed to keep the MIC tanks cool and stable, was shut off to save electricity. The vent gas scrubber, which could have neutralized escaping toxic gas, was out of service. The flare tower, meant to burn off dangerous emissions, was offline, missing a key section of piping. Each failed safeguard meant one less line of defense between the city and disaster. Inside the factory sat 3 large storage tanks filled with methyl isocyanate. The most notorious of them, Tank 610, held roughly 40 tons of the chemical. With no active cooling, minimal supervision, and non-functional emergency systems, it was a silent catastrophe waiting to happen. Workers noticed small irregularities in pressure readings and occasional leaks, but their warnings went unheeded. To those working the night shift, these conditions had become normal. They didn't realize they were standing on top of a chemical time bomb. Union Carbide's decision to prioritize profit over safety had built a trap with no escape. All it would take was one small mistake, one moment of oversight, to unleash a disaster that would forever change the city of Bhopal and the world's understanding of industrial safety. It was the night of December 2nd, 1984, when routine maintenance at the Union Carbide pesticide plant in Bhopal turned into a catastrophe. Around 10:30 that evening, a small group of workers began flushing pipes with water to clear debris. What they did not realize was that water had inadvertently entered one of the methyl isocyanate storage tanks, tank 610. The chemical reaction that followed was rapid and uncontrollable. As the water mixed with the toxic gas, the temperature and pressure inside the tank began to rise dramatically. By midnight, workers noticed the gauges climbing far beyond safe levels, but by then it was too late. Inside the tank, a violent chemical reaction was underway, producing heat, carbon dioxide, and enough pressure to rupture the system. The safety valves burst open, and the deadly gas began to escape into the air. The flare tower that was supposed to burn off the toxic fumes had been shut down for maintenance. The scrubber, which could have neutralized the leak, was out of service. Within minutes, a dense white cloud of methyl isocyanate began pouring out of the plant and drifting across the sleeping city. At first, people living near the factory thought it was a fire. Then came the burning in their eyes, the coughing and the choking that made it impossible to breathe. The gas was heavier than air, so it hugged the ground, spreading silently through the narrow streets of Bhopal. Within an hour, it had blanketed much of the southern part of the city, where tens of thousands of people lived in tightly packed homes. Those who tried to run found themselves disoriented by the thick, acrid cloud that stung their lungs and blinded them. Inside the plant, chaos reigned. Operators tried desperately to understand what was happening as alarms wailed. Many of them were unaware of the full danger of methyl isocyanate exposure. The control room filled with panic as they realized that nearly all of the emergency systems had failed. By the time they attempted to spray water into the air to disperse the gas, the leak had already reached an unstoppable scale. Outside, Bhopal was descending into horror. Families awoke to the sound of screaming animals dying in the streets and the overwhelming stench of chemicals. People stumbled through the darkness, clutching their throats and gasping for air. Within just a few hours, entire neighborhoods were overtaken by the invisible poison. Hospitals began to fill with victims, but even doctors did not know what they were dealing with or how to treat it. By the time dawn broke on December 3rd, the damage had already been done. The deadly gas had spread across more than 40 square kilometers of the city. Thousands were dead or dying, and tens of thousands more were severely injured. The world would soon awaken to the horrifying reality that one of the worst industrial disasters in history had just unfolded in the heart of India. When the sun rose over Bhopal on December 3rd, 1984, the city had transformed into a nightmare. The streets were eerily quiet except for the cries of the injured and the sound of sirens. Bodies lay scattered along roads, railway tracks, and near water pumps where people had tried to wash the gas from their faces. Families searched desperately for missing loved ones while the air remained thick with the lingering chemical odor. The early morning haze made it difficult to see more than a few meters ahead, and the full scale of the tragedy was still unknown. Hospitals were overwhelmed within hours. Doctors and nurses, many without proper protective gear, worked frantically to treat victims who arrived coughing, choking, and barely conscious. Most had no idea what gas they were dealing with. Some thought it was chlorine. Others suspected ammonia. Without clear information from the Union Carbide plant, medical staff resorted to washing patients' eyes with water and giving oxygen to those struggling to breathe. Supplies quickly ran out, oxygen cylinders were emptied, beds were filled, and hallways became makeshift treatment areas. By mid-morning, authorities began to realize the disaster's true magnitude. Reports indicated that thousands were dead and tens of thousands were suffering severe respiratory and eye injuries. Many victims died within hours of exposure, their lungs filled with fluid from chemical burns. The gas had spread silently through densely populated neighborhoods like Jayaprakash, Nagar, Chayankage, Holayapa, and Kazi Camp, areas that bordered the factory walls. Even days later, the smell of chemicals clung to the air, and birds fell lifeless from trees. Confusion spread among the survivors. Rumors circulated that the gas was still leaking, prompting waves of people to flee the city on foot. Thousands tried to board overcrowded trains heading out of Bhopal, carrying what little they could. Others sought shelter in temples and schools far from the factory zone. The government, initially slow to respond, began dispatching military units to help with evacuation and relief efforts. Trucks and buses transported the injured to hospitals in neighboring towns, but the damage was already irreversible. Union Carbide officials at first denied the severity of the situation. Representatives claimed the gas was only an irritant and that exposure would cause minor discomfort. But the evidence on the ground told a different story. Entire families had perished overnight, livestock lay dead in fields, and crops near the factory had turned yellow and brittle. Water sources were contaminated, making recovery even more difficult for the survivors who remained. As news of the disaster spread, journalists from across India and abroad arrived in Bhopal. Many were unprepared for the devastation they encountered. They described scenes of mass suffering, people blinded, struggling to breathe, and mourning loved ones. The city, once bustling with life, had become a symbol of industrial negligence and human vulnerability. The world was watching, but for the people of Bhopal, the nightmare was far from over. By the end of that day, it was clear that this was not just an accident. It was a human and environmental catastrophe. Hospitals were beyond capacity, morgues were overflowing, and the scale of death was unlike anything India had seen in peacetime. As dusk fell on December 3rd, the survivors faced a grim reality. The gas had cleared, but the disaster's consequences were only beginning. The immediate horror of the gas leak was just the beginning. In the months and years following December 2nd and 3rd, 1984, Bhopal faced a crisis of long-term health effects that would impact generations. Over 500,000 people were exposed to methyl isocyanate, and thousands developed chronic illnesses. Respiratory problems became widespread, with survivors suffering from persistent coughing, bronchitis, and pulmonary fibrosis. Many could no longer work, and entire families were plunged into poverty. Eye injuries were particularly severe. Reports indicated that tens of thousands experienced partial or complete blindness, corneal damage, and chronic irritation. Neurological effects were also common, including tremors, memory loss, and persistent headaches. Children born to women exposed to the gas experienced higher rates of birth defects, developmental delays, and physical abnormalities. Miscarriages increased dramatically in the months following the disaster, and fertility issues plagued survivors for years. The environmental impact compounded human suffering. Toxic chemicals from the plant seeped into the soil and groundwater, contaminating wells that people relied on for drinking water. Tests decades later still showed dangerous levels of carcinogenic substances like mercury and organophosphates. Crops grown near the factory were often unsafe to eat, and local wildlife populations suffered heavy losses. Cleanup efforts began slowly, but the sheer volume of hazardous waste, estimated at tens of thousands of tons, meant that the area remained perilous. Waterborne diseases became another major concern. With safe drinking water scarce, outbreaks of cholera, dysentery, and gastrointestinal illnesses surged. Hospitals continued to treat patients for chemical exposure while also addressing these secondary health crises. In addition, mental health issues emerged. Survivors experienced post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety at unprecedented rates. The psychological toll on the community was immense, as people mourned lost family members and struggled with ongoing uncertainty about their health and environment. Legal battles over responsibility and compensation dragged on for decades. The initial settlement of $470 million in 1989 was widely condemned as inadequate, amounting to only a few $100s per victim. Union Carbide, and later Dow Chemical, avoided further liability, leaving many survivors without sufficient support. Activists and NGOs fought tirelessly to demand proper healthcare, clean water, and long-term monitoring of affected populations. Even decades later, the abandoned factory remains a dangerous site. Corroded tanks, broken pipes, and chemical sludge litter the grounds. Attempts to remove or neutralize the waste have been slow and limited, covering only a fraction of the contamination. Local communities continue to rely on contaminated water, and children growing up near the site face higher health risks than the national average. The Bhopal disaster revealed a grim reality. The effects of industrial negligence do not end when the initial accident is over. Health, environment, and livelihoods can be compromised for generations. Survivors continue to fight for justice and remediation, yet the scale of contamination and the complexity of chemical hazards mean that true recovery may never be fully possible. Bhopal became a stark warning of what can happen when corporate shortcuts and regulatory failures intersect with human lives. Decades after the disaster, Bhopal remains a symbol of industrial failure and the human cost of negligence. Despite the passage of time, justice for the victims has been painfully slow and incomplete. Warren Anderson, the CEO of Union Carbide at the time, was arrested upon arrival in India in December 1984, but was quickly released on bail. He returned to the United States and never faced trial, dying in 2004 without answering for his role. Many Indian courts pursued civil and criminal cases for years, but the wheels of justice turned too slowly to meet the scale of suffering. The 1989 settlement of $470 million was widely criticized as grossly inadequate. For hundreds of thousands of victims, this amounted to just a few $100s per person. Survivors and activist groups have continually pushed for additional compensation and healthcare support, highlighting that many exposed to the gas still live with severe health problems, disabilities, and economic hardship. Dow Chemical, which acquired Union Carbide in 2001, has consistently maintained that no further liability exists, leaving millions of affected people without adequate remediation or medical care. The environmental legacy of the disaster remains equally alarming. The factory site continues to leach toxic chemicals into soil and groundwater. Cleanup efforts have addressed only a fraction of the hazardous waste, and groundwater contamination has exposed an estimated 200,000 people to carcinogenic chemicals. Local NGOs and activists describe the cleanup as a farce, with chemical sludge and corroded tanks still present decades later. This ongoing contamination perpetuates health risks and undermines any attempt at meaningful recovery. Bhopal's impact extends beyond India. The disaster became a global turning point in discussions of industrial safety, environmental regulations, and corporate accountability. International organizations, including the United Nations and the International Labour Organization, have cited Bhopal as a case study in the dangers of inadequate safety standards and regulatory oversight. It also influenced changes in chemical plant design, emergency preparedness, and hazard communication worldwide. Yet the disaster exposes a fundamental injustice. Those most affected are rarely the ones responsible. The people of Bhopal, already economically vulnerable, suffered the full consequences of corporate decisions made thousands of miles away. Entire families were uprooted, children were born with defects, and communities were forced to confront a poisoned environment with minimal support. The human cost is incalculable, and the scars, both physical and psychological, are permanent. Activists and survivors continue to demand justice, healthcare, and environmental remediation. Organizations such as the Bhopal Gas Padit Mahila Udyog Sangathan, Bhopal Gas Affected Women's Organization, work tirelessly to secure medical treatment, legal advocacy, and public awareness. Their fight illustrates that while decades have passed, the struggle for accountability and safety remains unresolved. The Bhopal disaster serves as a chilling reminder that industrial progress without responsibility can have catastrophic consequences. It underscores the need for rigorous safety standards, transparent corporate practices, and strong governmental oversight. The lessons of Bhopal are clear. When lives are treated as expendable in the pursuit of profit, the fallout can last generations. For the survivors and their families, the tragedy is not a historical footnote, it is an ongoing reality. The abandoned plant stands as a rusting monument to failure, a reminder of lives lost and the continuing dangers to those who remain. Bhopal teaches the world that industrial disasters are preventable, but only if accountability, vigilance, and humanity are placed above cost-cutting and negligence. On January 15, 1919, in the north end of Boston, something unexpected was about to happen. A massive storage tank, standing 50 feet tall and 90 feet wide, filled with molasses, sat just outside the busy neighborhood. It was owned by the Purity Distilling Company and held over 2.3 million gallons of molasses, roughly 13,000 tons of the thick, sweet liquid. This molasses was used to produce ethanol, which would be shipped out from nearby factories. However, the tank itself was flawed from the start. The construction was rushed and its design was poor, with some saying it was built with subpar materials. Right from the beginning, it leaked molasses, and locals often joked about the sticky smell in the air. But no one imagined that this small, ongoing issue would lead to a catastrophe. As winter wore on, the weather in Boston had warmed up, causing the molasses inside the tank to thin out, making it more volatile. With the tank filled to capacity, pressure began to build. The combination of overfilling and the expanding liquid caused the tank to become unstable. The molasses was no longer just a sweet, harmless substance. It was now a ticking time bomb, ready to explode, and that explosion would be unlike anything the city could prepare for. On the afternoon of January 15, 1919, Boston's North End became the scene of unimaginable chaos. At around 12:30 p.m., without warning, the massive molasses tank that had stood in the area for months suddenly gave way. The steel walls of the tank burst open with a deafening roar, sending a wall of thick, brown liquid surging out at a terrifying speed. The molasses moved with the force of a flash flood, racing through the streets at an estimated speed of 35 miles per hour. The wave of molasses, as much as 15 feet high in places, swept through the narrow streets, overwhelming everything in its path. The streets, once bustling with life, became a slippery, sticky mess. Buildings were battered by the sheer force of the wave, while cars and horses were quickly trapped in the thick molasses. The flood struck with such speed and power that many didn't have time to react. As the molasses continued to surge through the neighborhood, it trapped people and debris alike. Several homes, warehouses, and even train tracks were engulfed. People who were unfortunate enough to be caught in the path of the flood were swept off their feet, often unable to escape the overwhelming tide. The liquid, dense and heavy, trapped victims under its weight, making it difficult for anyone to get free. As chaos unfolded, cries for help echoed through the streets, but the molasses made rescue efforts incredibly difficult. Emergency responders and bystanders struggled to wade through the thick sludge, which was as sticky as it was dangerous. People who had been swept into the flood found themselves unable to move or breathe, unable to get free from the sticky grip of the molasses that held them fast. The scene was both terrifying and surreal, as the usually peaceful neighborhood was now in the grip of an unstoppable disaster. Once the molasses flood subsided, the full extent of the devastation began to unfold. The north end of Boston was left in ruins with wrecked buildings, overturned cars, and streets coated in a sticky, brown residue. The air was thick with the smell of molasses, which clung to everything it touched. The cleanup efforts would take weeks, but the impact of the disaster was far more than just physical. By the time the molasses flood had receded, a tragic toll had been taken. 21 people had lost their lives and over 70 others were injured. The victims came from all walks of life, from children playing in the streets to workers who had been near the tank when it collapsed. In the days that followed, the city was left to reckon with the loss of life, the destruction, and the trauma that would linger long after the molasses had been cleaned up. As the city began to recover from the chaos, the investigation into the cause of the disaster quickly became a matter of great urgency. The cause of the explosion was initially unclear, and authorities scrambled to understand how such a catastrophic event could have occurred. The molasses tank had been built by the Purity Distilling Company, a business that manufactured and stored molasses for use in alcohol production. Many speculated that the tank had been poorly constructed or improperly maintained, but it would take months for the full details to come to light. The first clue came when investigators found that the tank had been under immense pressure. The molasses inside the tank had fermented over time, which increased the pressure on the walls of the tank. This pressure likely contributed to the eventual rupture. However, the tank's design also came under scrutiny. It was revealed that the tank had been built with low-quality materials and had shown signs of weakness for months leading up to the disaster. The company had failed to take proper precautions to address these issues, even after the tank had exhibited signs of leaking. By the spring of 1919, the investigation led to a lawsuit filed against the Purity Distilling Company by the victims and their families. The case would eventually uncover not just a failure in engineering, but also a failure in oversight and accountability. The company's lack of concern for safety, as well as the poor construction of the tank, were deemed significant factors in the disaster. The legal battle would drag on for years, but the flood of molasses left an indelible mark on the city of Boston and its people, serving as a painful reminder of the deadly consequences of negligence. While the immediate aftermath of the molasses flood in Boston was filled with cleanup efforts and legal battles, the disaster left a long-lasting impact on the city and the surrounding community. The flood was not just a moment of chaos, but a turning point in how industrial safety and urban infrastructure would be approached moving forward. In the years that followed, Boston would make significant changes to both its building codes and its regulations regarding industrial facilities. The city's authorities, faced with public outrage and widespread fear, worked to ensure that such a tragedy would never happen again. The disaster brought into sharp focus the dangers of poorly constructed industrial structures in densely populated areas, especially those handling volatile materials. One of the major reforms that arose from the Molasses Flood was the increased scrutiny of industrial tanks and storage facilities. Prior to the flood, there were very few regulations governing the construction and maintenance of large storage tanks, particularly those used for the storage of liquids. After the disaster, the city enacted stricter guidelines for tank construction, including more rigorous inspections and higher safety standards. This was one of the first major steps in a larger movement toward industrial regulation that would continue to evolve throughout the 20th century. The impact of the flood was not just felt in Boston's legal and regulatory systems, but also in its culture. The Molasses Flood became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked industrial growth. The disaster was a stark reminder of how progress and development, if not carefully managed, could lead to devastating consequences. In many ways, the Molasses Flood was a wake-up call for other cities across the United States and around the world, highlighting the need for better planning, oversight, and accountability in industrial ventures. Additionally, the memory of the Molasses Flood lingered in the collective consciousness of Boston residents. Many still remembered the eerie, sickly sweet smell that lingered in the air for weeks after the event. The flood was also a focal point for discussions about urban safety, as it was clear that cities needed to prioritize the safety of their residents as they continued to grow and industrialize. The flood would be remembered not just for its immediate tragedy, but for its role in shaping the future of urban planning and industrial regulation. The Purity Distilling Company, responsible for the tank, would eventually be absorbed by the American Molasses Company, which faced ongoing scrutiny in the wake of the disaster. Although the company never fully recovered its reputation, the incident left an indelible mark on the history of industrial accidents in the United States. The tragedy of the Molasses Flood would be remembered as one of the strangest and most devastating industrial disasters in American history, reminding future generations of the importance of safety and responsibility in industrial design. The Boston Molasses Flood of 1917 may have been a forgotten disaster for many years, but its effects continue to echo throughout history. As one of the most unusual and deadly industrial accidents in American history, the tragedy captured the imagination of people everywhere. Over time, the memory of the disaster faded from public consciousness, but it left behind lasting lessons on the importance of safety in industrial design, urban planning, and regulatory oversight. In the years following the disaster, legal actions were taken against the companies involved, though many of the victims' families faced years of legal battles and little to no compensation. The outcome of these cases varied, but the publicity surrounding the flood helped shape the future of industrial regulation in the United States. The government, as well as businesses, recognized the need for increased safety measures and better oversight in the face of rapid industrial growth. The site of the disaster, which had once been a bustling industrial area, would later be redeveloped. Over time, it became home to various residential and commercial buildings. The Molasses Flood's exact location is now near the site of what is today known as the North End of Boston. The tragic events of that day may be distant in the past, but they remain an integral part of the city's history, symbolizing both the dangers of industrial negligence and the strength of a community in the face of adversity. Although many people associate the flood with its shocking and grotesque details, molasses coating streets and buildings, the sickening smell, the loss of lives, its legacy is not solely defined by the immediate horror. The Molasses Flood helped spark a broader movement towards stronger industrial safety laws, especially in the years following the flood. The public's outrage played a key role in demanding change and pushed forward the evolution of workplace safety, labor rights, and environmental protections. To this day, the Molasses Flood is often cited as an example of what can go wrong when regulatory systems fail to anticipate the dangers of industrial operations. It is a reminder that no matter how commonplace or benign a product might seem, when handled recklessly, it can have disastrous consequences. Though the flood is long over, the lessons learned from it continue to guide policy, law, and industrial safety standards to this day. The Molasses Flood, while an almost surreal and tragic event, stands as a reminder of how powerful and dangerous human innovation can be when safety is neglected. It serves as a testament to the resilience of the people of Boston who rebuilt their city and, in time, turned an era of disaster into one of progress, ensuring that future generations would learn from the past. The memory of the Molasses Flood will always remain a crucial chapter in the history of Boston and a warning to others about the importance of safety in the face of rapid industrialization.